Ever wonder why we chase those who ignore us, while overlooking those who give us their complete attention? This puzzling aspect of human nature fascinated Sigmund Freud over a century ago, and his discoveries remain more relevant than ever in today's world. Picture this scenario. You send someone a message, receive no response, and suddenly that person occupies your thoughts all day long. The longer their silence stretches, the stronger your desire for their reaction becomes. Freud would explain this as your unconscious mind being triggered into action. Through the next 6 chapters, we'll decode together the deepest workings of human psychology. You'll discover why ignoring represents one of the most potent psychological forces available, and learn how to harness this power consciously. Not for manipulation purposes, but to understand the hidden drives that motivate every single one of us. If you're prepared to peer behind the mask of human behavior and uncover the secrets Freud identified decades ago, stay with me. This journey will transform your understanding of interpersonal relationships forever. The initial signal our unconscious transmits is both fundamental and powerful. Whatever becomes scarce or unavailable automatically gains value. Freud recognized early on that the human drive system responds to scarcity like a compass responds to magnetism, inevitably and instinctively. Imagine engaging in conversation with someone who constantly replies, remains always available, responds to each of your messages within minutes. After several weeks, you notice something. The excitement has vanished. That feeling of conquest, of challenge, has disappeared. Freud would explain that your unconscious has registered the absence of drive tension in this situation. The drive apparatus, according to Freud's central insight, operates on the pleasure principle, but pleasure only emerges through tension, through the sensation of the not yet achieved. When someone is immediately available, this eliminates the psychological tension that maintains our interest. The unconscious interprets constant availability as low value within the social hierarchy. Ignoring, however, creates the opposite effect, psychological tension. Freud spoke of cathexis, the psychological energy we direct toward objects of our desire. The less available the object, the stronger the cathexis becomes. The unconscious begins working, fantasizing, projecting. This scarcity activates ancient survival mechanisms. In prehistoric times, scarcity often meant survival importance. Water held value because it was scarce. Food became desirable because it wasn't always accessible. Our brains never lost this programming. When you ignore someone, you unconsciously signal, "I am a scarce resource." The other person's brain responds with heightened attention, increased interest, intensified focus. Scarcity becomes psychological currency. However, be careful. Freud also warned against the dangers of overinterpretation. Ignoring only works when basic attraction already exists. Without this foundation, scarcity doesn't lead to desire, but to indifference. The art lies in understanding proper dosage. Too much availability kills tension. Too much distance destroys connection. The unconscious responds most strongly to rhythmic scarcity, sometimes near, sometimes distant, sometimes available, sometimes remote. Have you noticed that you think more intensely about someone when they don't respond immediately? Your unconscious follows exactly the laws Freud deciphered over a century ago. Yet scarcity is merely the beginning. The second psychological principle that activates is even more powerful and even more unconscious. The second signal from our unconscious proves even more fascinating. When someone ignores us, we automatically begin projecting, thereby creating an idealized version of that person, which often bears little resemblance to reality. Freud called this the projection of the ego ideal, a mechanism that can transform attraction into obsession. Picture this. Someone doesn't respond to your message for 3 days. What happens in your mind? You start speculating. Perhaps they're busy with important projects. Maybe they lead an exciting life full of adventures, or they're so desirable that they're constantly pursued by other people. With each hour of silence, the image you create becomes more magnificent. Freud recognized that the ego ideal represents that part of our psyche embodying our highest aspirations and desires. It's the vision of the person we'd like to become, more successful, more attractive, more desirable. When someone ignores us, we unconsciously project our ego ideal onto that person. The absence of information isn't interpreted by the unconscious as emptiness, but as a projection surface. Freud spoke of lack of reality testing. The less we know about someone, the freer our fantasy becomes to idealize that person. This projection operates according to a simple psychological law. Our brain automatically fills knowledge gaps with positive assumptions, but only regarding people to whom we already feel an emotional connection. When someone we find attractive ignores us, the unconscious interprets this behavior as a sign of special qualities. The mechanism intensifies through what Freud called transference. We transfer characteristics of important reference figures from our past onto the ignoring person. Was our father successful but distant? Our mother beautiful but unapproachable? These archetypal patterns become reactivated. Ignoring becomes confirmation of status and worth. The unconscious concludes, if this person ignores me, they must have something better to do. If they have something better to do, they must be valuable. If they're valuable, I want them even more. Freud warned, however, about the danger of these projections. They often have little to do with the real person. The ignoring individual becomes a canvas for our own longings and desires. We don't fall in love with them, but with our projection of them. This idealization explains why people are often disappointed when the ignoring person suddenly becomes available. Reality cannot compete with projection. The actual conversation proves less fascinating than the imagined ones, the real personality less exciting than the projected one. This mechanism becomes particularly powerful in people with strong narcissistic components, which means practically everyone. Ignoring triggers the question, am I not important enough? The ego defends against this injury by elevating the ignoring person. They're so special that they can ignore me. Do you recognize this pattern in yourself? Have you ever idealized someone simply because that person was distant? Your unconscious followed exactly the laws of projection that Freud described. But idealization is merely preparation for the third, even more powerful psychological principle, the compulsion to repeat. The third signal from the depths of our psyche is perhaps the most powerful, the repetition compulsion. Freud discovered that people unconsciously tend to repeat traumatic or unresolved situations, and ignoring activates this archaic mechanism like a psychological switch. Imagine this. During your childhood, one parent was emotionally distant. You desperately tried to gain their attention, sometimes successfully, mostly in vain. Today, decades later, someone ignores you, and suddenly the same intense energy awakens within you, the same urge to fight, to prove yourself, to conquer. Freud would say, your repetition compulsion has been activated. The repetition compulsion stands as one of Freud's most significant discoveries. It states that the unconscious compulsively attempts to master unresolved conflicts from the past, even when the conscious mind has long understood that these battles are hopeless. The psyche hopes to finally find a different, satisfying solution through repetition. Ignoring triggers this mechanism because it reactivates archetypal loss experiences. The first rejection, the first unrequited love, the first refusal, all these wounds never completely heal. They slumber in the unconscious, waiting to be awakened by similar situations. Freud recognized that people are particularly susceptible to partners who mirror their early relationship patterns. Those who had to fight for love as children feel drawn to people who reproduce this dynamic, not because it's pleasant, but because it's familiar, and because the unconscious hopes to win this time. The repetition compulsion explains why ignoring works so powerfully. It's not just scarcity or projection, it's the reactivation of old, unresolved battles. The person who ignores us unconsciously becomes a symbol for everyone we ever wanted to conquer but couldn't. This dynamic intensifies through what Freud called cathexis energy. The more psychological energy we invested in unresolved conflicts in the past, the stronger the cathexis of new situations that trigger these patterns. Ignoring becomes the stage for old, unfinished dramas. Particularly insidious, the repetition compulsion operates unconsciously. The person thinks consciously, "I find this person interesting." Unconsciously, however, a different program runs. "I must conquer this person to prove that I'm lovable." Freud also observed the phenomenon of reality denial. People caught in repetition compulsion often ignore obvious signs that the other person has no interest. They interpret every minimal reaction as a glimmer of hope, every brief conversation as a breakthrough. Reality testing fails because the unconscious doesn't want to see the real person, but the battlefield for the old, unresolved conflict. The repetition compulsion also explains why people often stop pursuing once the other person becomes available. The unconscious conflict isn't, "I want this person," but rather, "I want to prove I can conquer an unattainable person." For once conquered, they lose their symbolic value. This mechanism proves particularly strong in people who received inconsistent rewards in childhood, sometimes attention, sometimes ignorance. The unconscious learned that fighting sometimes leads to success. This variable reinforcement is, according to Freud, one of the strongest psychological conditioning mechanisms. Have you ever noticed that you fight most intensely for people who aren't actually good for you? Your repetition compulsion followed the patterns Freud deciphered over a century ago. But the compulsion to repeat is merely preparation for the fourth principle, psychological reactance against lost control. The fourth signal from our unconscious reveals one of the most fundamental human characteristics. As soon as we feel we're losing control, a powerful defense mechanism activates, which Freud described as emotional reactance. Ignoring serves as the perfect trigger for this psychological uprising. Picture this. You've started a conversation, the other person seemed interested, and suddenly, radio silence. No more responses, no explanation, no reaction. What happens in your mind? First confusion, then anger, finally an almost compulsive urge to fix the situation. Freud would recognize your ego defending against the loss of control. Emotional reactance is a protective mechanism of the ego. Freud recognized that the human ego responds to the loss of agency with intensified desire. What gets taken away from us, we want even more, not necessarily because of its objective value, but because of the control loss that the removal symbolizes. Ignoring represents a form of power denial. The other person refuses us the power to generate a reaction. They refuse us confirmation that our words have impact. They refuse us control over the communication flow. The ego interprets this as a direct threat to its autonomy. Freud described various defense mechanisms that activate in this situation. The first is rationalization. We invent reasons for the silence. They're busy. They overlooked my message. Their phone is broken. These rationalizations protect the ego from the painful recognition that we might not be important enough. The second mechanism is projection of responsibility. We shift blame to external circumstances or the other person. They're playing games. They're immature. They don't know what they're missing. This projection maintains our self-esteem by externalizing responsibility. Particularly powerful is the third mechanism, reactance intensification. And Freud observed that people respond to restrictions of their freedom with increased desire for exactly that freedom. Ignoring restricts our communicative freedom, and the unconscious responds with intensified urge to communicate. This reactance explains why people often become more obsessed the more they're ignored. It's not just attraction, it's psychological resistance against felt powerlessness. The ego fights to regain its capacity for action. Freud warned about the self-deception inherent in this process. People often interpret their reactance as intensified feelings for the other person. I think about them constantly, so I must love them. In truth, they think about them constantly because their ego cannot accept the loss of control. Reactance intensifies through what Freud called narcissistic injury. Being ignored wounds our self-image as important, noteworthy individuals. The ego attempts to heal this injury by regaining the attention of the ignoring person as proof of our own importance. Particularly insidious, emotional reactance can become addictive. People grow accustomed to the adrenaline rush of fighting, to the intensity of challenge. Normal, balanced relationships appear boring compared to this emotional high-performance sport. Freud also recognized the paradox of reactance. The more we fight against control loss, the more control we give the other person over our emotions. We become puppets of our own defense mechanisms. This mechanism explains why playing hard to get proves so effective. It doesn't just trigger scarcity and projection, but also the fundamental rebellion of the ego against felt powerlessness. Do you recognize this reactance in yourself? Have you ever fought harder for someone after they distanced themselves? Your unconscious followed the laws of emotional reactance that Freud described over a century ago. But reactance is merely the surface of an even deeper mechanism, transference, and the activation of old, never-healed wounds. The fifth signal from the depths of our psyche proves the most intimate and painful: transference. Freud discovered that ignoring functions like a key that opens the locked doors to our earliest and deepest injuries. What begins as a simple non-response becomes the reactivation of decades-old emotional wounds. Envision this: a child waits for hours for their busy father to come home from work and spend time with them. But the father is tired, distant, emotionally unavailable. The child interprets this absence as personal failure. I'm not important enough. I'm not lovable enough. This wound never completely heals. It waits in the unconscious for reactivation. Today, 30 years later, someone ignores you for 3 days, and suddenly it's there again. The old wound, as fresh and painful as if it occurred yesterday. Freud called this transference, the unconscious projection of old relationship patterns onto new people. Transference operates according to a simple but powerful principle. Our unconscious doesn't distinguish between past and present. A person who ignores us today unconsciously becomes a symbol for everyone who ever ignored, rejected, or emotionally abandoned us. Freud identified various types of transference. In paternal transference, the ignoring person becomes a substitute for the distant, emotionally unavailable father. The inner child awakens and fights desperately for the attention it never received back then. In maternal transference, ignoring reactivates the fear of love, withdrawal by the mother. The unconscious interprets the missing response as a threat to attachment, as potential emotional abandonment, and mobilizes all survival strategies the child developed then. Particularly powerful is sibling transference. Those who had to compete for parental attention against siblings as children experience every form of ignoring as repetition of this early competitive situation. The ignoring person unconsciously becomes the favored sibling who stole parental love. Freud observed, the more intense the transference, the more irrational the behavior becomes. People in transference situations don't act as adults, but as the wounded child they once were. They use the same strategies as back then: pleading, fighting, trying extra hard, wanting to be perfect. The activation of old wounds explains why ignoring triggers such disproportionately strong reactions. It's not the current situation that hurts so much. It's the resonance with all similar situations from the past. Every ignored message becomes confirmation of old beliefs. I'm not enough. I'm not important. I'm not lovable. Freud warned about the danger of re-traumatization. People unconsciously seek situations that trigger their old wounds in desperate hope of finally having a different, healing experience. But usually, they only repeat the old trauma in new form. Transference intensifies through what Freud called attachment hunger. People with early attachment injuries develop an insatiable hunger for emotional security. Every form of distance or ignoring gets experienced as an existential threat. Particularly insidious, transference makes us blind to the reality of the other person. We don't see who they really are, but project all our old relationship figures onto them. Communication doesn't happen between two adults, but between our inner child and our internalized parental figures. Freud also discovered the phenomenon of counter-transference. Often we activate similar transference patterns in other people. Our own behavior triggers their old wounds, which intensifies their reactions, which in turn triggers our wounds, creating an endless cycle of old pain. Healing, according to Freud, begins with awareness. Once we recognize that our intense reaction to being ignored has less to do with the current person than with old, unresolved injuries, the pattern loses its unconscious power over us. Have you noticed that certain types of rejection affect you particularly intensely? Your transference patterns follow the laws Freud deciphered over a century ago. But understanding these mechanisms represents only the first step. The sixth and final principle shows us how to apply this knowledge consciously and ethically. The sixth and concluding principle leads us to practical mastery. How do I apply Freud's insights ethically and effectively? The art doesn't lie in manipulative ignoring, but in conscious design of availability and distance, what Freud would call therapeutic abstinence in relationships. Imagine this. You now understand all psychological mechanisms that ignoring triggers. You know about scarcity, projection, repetition compulsion, reactance and transference. Now comes the crucial question. How do you use this knowledge without resorting to manipulation, but to create authentic, healthy attraction? Freud taught us that the most powerful form of attraction doesn't emerge through complete absence, but through rhythmic availability. Like a therapist who remains present when necessary but leaves space for the patient's projection and development, you too can learn to consciously dose your emotional availability. The first element of calculated unavailability is selective response. Instead of immediately answering every message, choose consciously. Respond quickly to important, deep or interesting communication. Let superficial or worthless messages deliberately sit longer. Your unconscious sends the signal, my attention is valuable and must be earned. The second element is planned unpredictability. Freud recognized that predictability kills tension. Consciously vary your response times and availability, sometimes immediately present, sometimes busy for hours. This variable reinforcement keeps the other person's interest at an optimal level. The third element is authentic occupation. The most powerful form of unavailability is genuine unavailability. Develop a life so fulfilling and interesting that you're actually busy. Hobbies, projects, social contacts, personal goals, the richer your life, the more natural your periodic unavailability becomes. Freud warned, however, about the danger of over-application. Too much distance destroys connection. Too much unavailability gets interpreted as disinterest. The art lies in balance, enough distance for tension, enough closeness for connection. The fourth element is emotional authenticity. The strongest form of attraction emerges when your unavailability isn't performed, but expresses your genuine value and real priorities. People intuitively sense the difference between manipulative distance and authentic self-respect. Freud also taught the principle of therapeutic boundaries. Just as a good therapist sets clear boundaries to protect the therapeutic process, you should learn to establish healthy boundaries in relationships, not from calculation, but from self-respect. The fifth element is the principle of quality over quantity. Instead of having many superficial interactions, focus on few but intense connections. This selectivity makes each of your attentions more valuable. Particularly important is the sixth element, conscious reflection. Use your understanding of Freudian mechanisms for self-reflection too. Why do you react so strongly to certain people? Which old wounds get triggered? This self-knowledge makes you both more attractive and less manipulable. Freud emphasized that true power doesn't lie in controlling others, but in mastering one's own psychological processes. People who understand their own transferences and projections automatically become less needy and therefore more attractive. The seventh and most important element is ethical responsibility. Betty. With great psychological understanding comes great responsibility. Don't use your knowledge to hurt or manipulate others, but to create healthy, balanced relationships. Mastery ultimately lies in no longer needing to consciously apply techniques. When you lead a fulfilling life, have authentic boundaries, and understand your psychological patterns, natural attraction emerges without manipulation, without games, without emotional injuries. Freud would say the highest goal isn't making others chase us, but becoming so integral and self-confident that the right people are naturally attracted and the wrong ones naturally distance themselves. Have you recognized how you can apply these principles in your own life? The art of calculated unavailability is ultimately the art of leading a life so valuable that other people want to appreciate it. Which country are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know.